what neighbors complained about was just this feeling of being watched all the time. So these guys that sit outside 24/7, they will tell people walking on public sidewalks, "What are you doing here? You need to move along." There are a lot of cameras around. I was followed a couple of times when I was down reporting, so it definitely doesn't feel like a just homey neighborhood where you go ask your neighbor for a cup of sugar.
Heather Knight, San Francisco Bureau Chief from the New York Times. Thank you so much for joining the Tech Report today.
Thanks for having me.
You have been writing some really interesting articles as of late about Mark Zuckerberg and kind of his home life and how it, I guess, taints his image. Now, just for our audience to understand, in April, you wrote about how two free primary schools funded and founded by Mark Zuckerberg and his wife, Priscilla Chan, in 2016 for underprivileged students in the area would be closing down next summer. At the same time, the Zuckerbergs have been operating a private school, or a homeschooling pod, as they refer to it, on their land for around 14 students. So can you walk me through, Heather, how these two things in conjunction with each other have sparked a bit of controversy?
Yeah, so I wrote in April about how Mark Zuckerberg and Priscilla Chan were pulling the funding from the primary school in East Palo Alto. That's a quite low income town just next door to Palo Alto, which is famous for Stanford University and a lot of tech campuses. And they had been funding this school for low income children and their families for years and then abruptly pulled the funding. Nobody gave a super clear answer for why that was. They certainly didn't. But when I wrote that story, I got an interesting tip in my email, which was, if you think that's a good story, wait till I tell you about what he's doing at his compound in Palo Alto. So that's when I learned that he was not only closing a school for low income children, but running a private school for his own daughters and 12 other children out of one of his many homes in Palo Alto, which is not kosher according to city codes.
So at this present time, Heather, you don't know why those two schools, those that are funded by the Zuckerbergs, have been closed down.
There was no reason given by them or the school, but we talked to board members and parents and others, and some people thought that it was an effort to pull back on DEI initiatives, which is something that the two had supported for many years. And then when President Trump was elected and many of the tech titans started courting his favor, many of them pulled back on DEI initiatives that they had been supporting in the past. But also the schools were not getting extra private funding, so it was all on them, and they weren't successful in terms of luring public or private money in addition to the Zuckerberg money, so that was another reason given.
So the school, the private school, the homeschooling pod, as they refer to it, that's on the Zuckerberg property, it broke a few zoning laws in the area, which led to an investigation into homeschooling situation that they'd been operating since the pandemic. Is that kind of what happened?
Right. So, the neighbors had been noticing that it seemed to be operating like a school. Other parents would drive up in the mornings, drop kids off, come back in the afternoons. It appeared they were going on field trips during the day. So, they thought a school was operating and asked questions of the city. They were very frustrated that the city of Palo Alto didn't really do anything to crack down on it. And then so I did some investigating, and they had indeed filed paperwork with the state showing that that school was a private school that they were running. It was supporting 14 children's education and employing 6 adults. So it was filed as paperwork with the state as a private school, but that was not legal in Palo Alto.
Heather, when you were speaking to these neighbours, these Crescent Park neighbours, about the fact that they were operating this school and not adhering to these zoning laws, but also at the same time they were shutting down these funded schools for lower income kids, did the neighbours talk about those two things together?
Yes, that's why they contacted me in the first place, just saying that it was a bit hypocritical that he was shutting funding for low-income kids while running this fancy private school in his compound for his own kids and other wealthy kids. And interestingly, when I interviewed his spokesperson, they said, well, these children at this private school really need continuity. We didn't want to disrupt their lives while he had just closed down this school for many other children. So obviously that disrupted those children's lives.
And the Zuckerbergs were forced to close down their homeschool pod because they were breaking these residential zoning laws. So does the New York Times or you, Heather, know where they've moved these operations to?
They just said another location, but didn't wanna tell me where that is.
Your public enemy number one with Mark Zuckerberg and his
I
family.
haven't been invited for dinner at the compound, shockingly.
Shocking, shocking. So, Heather, Zuckerberg's compound, it's always been a bit of an issue with neighbours from what you've really seen through your investigative reporting because over the span of these 14 years, he's purchased, him and Priscilla have purchased 11 homes in the Crescent Park area for $110 million and built this massive estate. So, regardless of what's happened with these schools, they've been a controversial family regardless in the area.
Right, the school was just really one piece of it, a pretty small piece overall. He, started with one house and then kept adding more and more, offering, deals to neighbors they couldn't refuse, sometimes for 3 times what the homes were worth. So, obviously, offering $14 million to buy a home that's maybe worth $5 million for him is no big deal, but for a family receiving that money, it's hard to say no. So, gradually, he was able to add to his property, so he owns 11, just on this one block and a couple bits and pieces across the street, and he has turned it into a giant compound. The most frustrating part for neighbors was 8 years of solid construction blocking these streets, damaging their own cars, putting up tow-away signs so neighbors couldn't park their own cars on their own street, um, being very loud and disruptive and digging out 7,000 square feet of basement. He called it a basement, they call it a billionaire's bat cave. So you can imagine how disruptive that is.
So, in one of your articles, you wrote last month about how Zuckerberg had used Edgewood Drive and Hamilton Avenue like a Monopoly game board, which I think was such a funny way to put it, and that the tranquility of the neighborhood had vanished. When you spoke to these 9 neighbors, I know that you said quite a number of them didn't want to be named, but what were your big takeaways about how they felt?
A lot of them had lived there for decades. They were older couples who had moved in when their children were little and just talked about sort of this idyllic neighborhood, these big trees and a great public school around the corner, and kids would ride their bikes and they'd have these block parties and everything was happy. Everybody knew each other. And that really changed when Mark Zuckerberg moved in and started buying a lot of families out, filling the streets with huge trucks, cement mixers, and just huge equipment. Became very disruptive, and he built hedges around the whole thing, big hedge walls, so you can't see, um, into the property at all. There's just no feeling of community. That's what they really missed.
You wrote about a lot about how the surveillance of the neighborhood had changed, with, of course, Mark Zuckerberg. He's a public figure. He's still the CEO of Meta. He, you know, it's dangerous to be him, pretty much. He's a sitting duck, some could say. So how has the situation changed in the neighborhood when it comes to that security?
Yes, that was another big piece that the neighbors were very bothered by. So, his spokesperson said, and I have no reason to disbelieve this, that he gets credible threats all the time. He is at risk, certainly, he and his family. So Meta does pay for security on those streets, and every time I visited, I saw security people parked in, cars outside the homes and kind of up and down the blocks. What neighbors complained about was just this feeling of being watched all the time. So these guys that sit outside 24/7, they will tell people walking on public sidewalks, "What are you doing here? You need to move along." There are a lot of cameras around. I was followed a couple of times when I was down reporting, so it definitely doesn't feel like a just homey neighborhood where you go ask your neighbor for a cup of sugar. They will block you. You will not get to his front door for a cup of sugar.
What about when you were speaking to the neighbors? Did they say that they'd had any interactions with the Zuckerbergs themselves?
They said in the beginning they were a little bit more friendly. They did host about 20 neighbors at their first home back when they were long before they bought all these other properties and they were just thinking of doing some work and they explained what they wanted to do. And the neighbors said they were pretty friendly and they did understand that this could be disruptive. Tried to make some accommodations, but it just went worse from there. And over the past several years, they said they never see them. So there's just this giant fortress in the middle of the neighborhood, but they never see the 2 people who've created it.
What about the kids? Are the kids involved in any of the community, activities? You mentioned it's a beautiful, couple of streets to be living on. You would think that there would be, yeah, as you mentioned, neighborhood parties or even just kids' sports.
They do have parties, but the neighbors are not invited. So that was another funny little detail that they sometimes would get these gift boxes with, donuts or chocolates or sparkling wine saying, "We're having a party, just wanted you to know," but no invitation. But the funniest gift was, noise canceling headphones. They were like, "If you have to give your neighbors noise canceling headphones because of what you're doing, maybe you should just be quieter."
That's so funny, and we were talking about how they've bought 11 homes, in this 14-year period, and I think 5 of those homes were merged into the larger estate that they live on. One of the houses was they were using to operate that private school. So, are there just multiple homes that the Zuckerbergs own that are just sitting there without any use?
Yes, that was another thing that the neighbors brought up, which was, in Silicon Valley and the Bay Area and California in general, there's a huge housing crunch. It's very hard for people of any income to find housing they can afford. So they just felt that it was not fair to be keeping several homes empty for no apparent purpose. The Zuckerberg's spokesperson did say that some extended family lives in some of them, but said others are not inhabited at all and that they need some repair work, so that kind of clued me into maybe more construction is coming.
Is there anything you're working on, next? Another follow-up, Heather?
I've been talking to a city council member in Palo Alto who wants to figure out how to crack down on these. He, believe it or not, that they're not the only billionaire compound in town. So the city is trying to figure out how they can better manage these before they get out of control and drive the neighbors insane.
Heather Knight from the New York Times, thank you so much for joining the Tech Report today.
Thank you.